When I saw this 1960s cookie book at a local antique store, I knew I had to get it and try out some of the recipes. I thought it was really interesting that cookie was spelled with a Y instead of an IE. And as I flipped through the grease-stained pages in preparation for this video, I started to feel kind of emotional. My heart started to kind of ache. Someone used to love and use this book that I held in my hands. It was a part of their life, not just a cookbook sitting on their shelf. It obviously brought joy to their life. And I noticed that the previous owner had marked some of their favorite recipes with a check mark or the words good or very good. They even marked a couple of the recipes with what I believe says fair, a warning that these recipes weren't stellar. And I thought it would be fun to try out some of the recipes marked good to see if the previous owner and I agree. So first we have a recipe for lemon bars. Now I became a lemon lover later in life, but now it's one of my favorite dessert flavors, so I'm excited to try this recipe. By the way, I'm pretty sure that I baked from an edition of this cookbook when I was a kid. These individual photos of the cookies at the bottom of the page seem really familiar to me. Anyway, this recipe calls for 1 cup of flour. Now the cookbook specifically calls for gold medal flour, so I decided to go ahead and use that for the recipes. According to goldmedalflour.com, gold medal flour dates back to 1880 when Cadwallader C. Washburn's flour won the gold medal at the first Miller's International Exhibition. After winning the esteemed award, orders poured in and Washburn began using the gold medal name on his best grade of flour. Gold medal flour was born. And it was the Washburn Crosby Company that created the beloved Betty Crocker character back in 1921. And in 1928, the Washburn Crosby Company merged with 3 other mills to become General Mills, and thus Betty joined the General Mills family. Which is why this cookbook was copyrighted in 1963 by General Mills, and why most of the recipes call for gold medal flour. Okay, you'll also need ½ cup of butter or margarine. I will definitely be using butter. I am not a fan of margarine. 1/4 cup of confectioner's sugar, 2 eggs, 1 cup of granulated sugar, ½ teaspoon of baking powder, 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and 2 tablespoons of lemon juice. Okay, let's make them. You start by preheating your oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, which the cookbook notes is moderate. So if cooks had an oven without temperature adjustments, they could still make this recipe. Next, you measure the flour by the dipping method, which is described on page 5. You simply dip your measuring cup into the flour sack or canister and level it off with a spatula or straight-edged knife. You're not supposed to tap the cup or pack more flour into it before leveling it off. Then you blend the flour, butter, and confectioner's sugar thoroughly. The recipe didn't say to cut the butter into smaller pieces first, but I decided to go ahead and slice it up since that makes it much easier to cut in. The recipe also didn't say what temperature the butter should be, but I decided to use cold butter. There also aren't specific instructions for what tool you should use to blend these ingredients together, but I decided to use a pastry blender. The thing about Betty Crocker recipes, especially vintage ones in my experience, is they're pretty no frills when it comes to directions. They assume that you'll just know what to do in certain instances. I personally like this kind of recipe for easy everyday cooking because it's much quicker to navigate the recipe, but it could be confusing if you don't have a lot of baking experience or if you're trying to bake something more complicated. I decided to switch to my hands to finish blending the ingredients together. It's possible the recipe intended you to use room temperature butter here, which would make blending easier, but this worked out well in the end. I decided to blend until the dough stuck together when I squished it with my hands. The recipe didn't say to, but I decided to line the square pan with some parchment paper to make removing the bars easier. Then you add the dough and press it evenly into the pan. I used a combination of my hands and a measuring cup for this. Then you bake in the moderate oven for 20 minutes. The recipe didn't give visual cues as to when the crust is done baking, but mine was turning golden brown on the edges after 20 minutes. Okay, next you beat the remaining ingredients together and pour that over the baked crust. Then you bake for 20 to 25 minutes more. The recipe says do not overbake with an exclamation point, but it doesn't give an indication of what overbaked would look like. I started with 18 minutes, and when I went to check on it, I was afraid that I had already overbaked it. The top already looked fairly dark at this point, but I allowed it to cool in the pan for a while, then sliced it into squares and put them on a plate to serve. Okay, so the lemon bars have cooled off and now I'm ready to give them a taste test. Now, I feel like their color isn't quite as yellow as is advertised in the cookbook, and the top browned a little more than I thought it would, so I was worried that I overbaked it. But looking at the center of the lemon bars, they do not look like they're overbaked. So I'm gonna give a center bar a try. So to me, it looks like there is about an equal amount of crust and filling. I do tend to really like the crust part of lemon bars, so I am good with that. But I'm curious to see how much of a lemon flavor there is. I personally probably would have put some lemon zest in as well as the juice. This is just relying on the juice for the lemon flavor, but let's give it a go. I would say that's very much a classic lemon bar. The crust has a really good flavor, very buttery, pretty much like a shortbread flavor. The filling is nice and soft and also smooth. I would say that there isn't a super strong lemon flavor and it's not super tart. There seems to be a pretty high ratio of sugar in this recipe, but it is pretty hard to argue with that. I would say if I made it again, I would probably lower the amount of sugar a little bit, but I'm not sure if that would mess with the texture of the bars too much because the texture is really nice, very smooth. But I would maybe play around with either adding some lemon flavoring or maybe some lemon zest to boost that lemon flavor, but that's pretty good. I would not be sad to see that on a cookie tray. I'm just not a huge fan of desserts that are extremely sweet, but if you're used to the normal level of sweetness that's typical in like American desserts, I think you would really like this. It's definitely not going to make you pucker up because of the sourness. Well, the previous owner hasn't failed me so far, but let's try the next cookie. My kids are gonna love these. So the next recipe is marked very good, so I have high expectations for it. It's a recipe for coconut chocolate meringue bites. And it says, from Diana Williams of San Francisco, formerly of our staff. And there is a color photo of it, so I can get an idea of what it's supposed to look like. This recipe looks a little bit more involved than the first one. It has 3 different layers, a crust, then the coconut chocolate nut layer, and the meringue layer on top. Let's get started to make it. For this recipe, you'll need 3/4 cup of butter or margarine. Again, the recipe doesn't indicate what temperature the butter should be. 1/2 cup of brown sugar packed, 1/2 cup of granulated sugar, 3 eggs separated, 1 teaspoon of vanilla, 2 cups of gold medal flour, 1 teaspoon of baking powder, 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda, 1/4 teaspoon of salt, 1 6-ounce package of semi-sweet chocolate pieces, 1 cup of flaked or grated coconut, 3/4 cup of coarsely chopped nuts. I love pecans, so I chose those, and another cup of brown sugar packed. Okay, you start by preheating your oven to 350 degrees or to a moderate temperature. Then you grease an oblong pan that's 13 by 9.5 by 2 inches. My pan isn't exactly those dimensions, but close enough. Next, you mix the butter, 1/2 cup of brown sugar, granulated sugar, egg yolks, and vanilla together. You can either beat for 2 minutes on medium speed with a mixer or 300 vigorous strokes by hand. I opted for the mixer. Then you measure the flour by the dipping method or sifting. And then you blend the flour with the baking powder, soda, and salt, then mix into the butter mixture thoroughly. Then you spread or pat the dough into the pan. I decided to press it with the measuring cup and sprinkle with the chocolate pieces, coconut, and nuts. In a separate bowl, you beat the egg whites until frothy. Then add the 1 cup of brown sugar gradually and beat until stiff. And spread that over the nuts. It was a little challenging to not disturb the nuts and pecans while spreading, but it was doable. Then you bake for 35 to 40 minutes. Again, the recipe didn't say what it should look like when it's done, but it looked done to me. Then you let it cool and cut into bars. These were definitely not the easiest bars to cut. I was worried that they would be difficult to remove from the pan as well, but they actually came out pretty easily. They weren't quite as neat looking as in the photo, but it was pretty close. The meringue topping definitely cracked more, which makes me wonder if I baked them too long. I feel like compared to the picture in the book, my bars are a little bit darker on top, which maybe I baked mine longer than theirs. Maybe it was the type of sugar I used. The recipe didn't specify whether it was dark brown sugar or light brown sugar. I used light brown sugar, but maybe the brand of brown sugar that I used is darker than the one that they would have used. All right, let's see if these indeed are very good. I have a glass of milk here to kind of cleanse my palate and maybe counterbalance the sweetness. In total, there's 2 cups of sugar in these, so I'm a little worried that they're going to be overly sweet, but let's give them a try. They look a little bit ooey gooey from the chocolate. They look delicious. Smells amazing. They're a little messy to eat, but I do like the flavors. I I would say that is quite good. It is a little sweet for my tastes, and I could probably do with a few more pecans because I'm a big pecan lover, and I would probably toast the pecans first because the pecans don't really get toasty since they're covered with the meringue topping, and I really love it when pecans have that toasty flavor, so that is probably a change that I would make, and I would probably use dark chocolate chips, but dark chocolate probably wouldn't be quite as melty as these are. I'll try a bit of the meringue by itself. The meringue is mostly kind of like adds a neat texture. It's not super flavorful. I think because you use brown sugar, it is more flavor than a meringue typically would be. But maybe if you added a little bit of vanilla or some kind of flavoring, you'd get even more flavor out of it. I later brought these to some family members to try, and they commented that they had a coffee flavor. And after they said that, I agreed. The crust is pretty soft. It basically tastes like a cookie. So unlike with the lemon bars, which are kind of like a shortbread crust, this is more like a cookie crust. I would say I would maybe toast the coconut as well, just to bring out some of those flavors. I think that if you're a big fan of this type of bar, it would definitely earn that rating of very good. For me, I think that I actually preferred the lemon bars, so I would maybe switch the ratings. The sweetness level is just a little bit high for me, and I think they could be even better if the coconut and the pecans were toasted. But it's a pretty dang good little cookie bar. But there are 3 steps to them, so for me personally, I don't know if the flavor payoff is worth those 3 steps. This is a fun cookie bar. I mean, I'm eating the whole thing. I don't know that I can quite agree with the previous owner on this one, but we're 2 different people with 2 different taste preferences. So, all right, let's move on to the final recipe. The final recipe comes from some loose pages tucked in the back of the cookbook. There are little treasures like this throughout the cookbook. A clipping from a magazine, a page from another cookbook, a handwritten recipe, and I'd love to try those out sometime. The pages at the back of the book look as though they were from an older or smaller edition of this cookbook. There are a couple of recipes marked fair in here, but on the opposite page, there's a recipe for oatmeal refrigerator cookies that is marked good, and that's what we'll be cooking next. It says that these are nice and chewy with a molasses lemon tang. This was voted the best oatmeal cookie ever tasted when sent to our recipe contest by Mrs. J. A. Gminder of St. Paul, Minnesota. The distinguishing molasses lemon flavor was an idea from Mrs. Richard Nugent, Brooklyn, New York. I appreciate how this recipe is laid out. So the recipe is divided into 2 sections. This method just goes well with how my brain works, so I really appreciate that. So to make these, you'll need half a cup of soft shortening, half a cup of sugar, half a cup of brown sugar, 1 egg, 1½ teaspoons of grated lemon rind, 1½ tablespoons of molasses, half a teaspoon of vanilla, 7/8 of a cup or 3/4 cup plus 2 tablespoons of sifted gold medal flour, half a teaspoon of soda, half a teaspoon of salt, and 1½ cups of rolled oats. First, you mix together the shortening, sugars, eggs, lemon rind, molasses, and vanilla thoroughly. Next, you sift the flour, soda, and salt together. I sifted the flour before measuring. Then you mix that into the butter and sugar mixture. Add the oats and mix thoroughly with your hands. This was definitely messy and sticky. Then you press and mold the dough into a smooth roll that's about 2½ inches in diameter. The oats made it a little difficult to make the roll smooth, but you know. The recipe said to wrap in wax paper, but I decided to use plastic wrap instead. Then you chill until stiff or several hours. With a thin, sharp knife, cut into thin slices 1/8 to 1/16 inch thick. I found that the oats made it difficult to get uniform cookies, but I did my best. Then you place the slices a little bit apart on an ungreased baking sheet and bake at 400 degrees or moderately hot until lightly browned, about 8 to 10 minutes. The recipe didn't say to, but I let them rest on the baking sheet for 5 minutes. This turned out to be a mistake since the cookies stuck to the ungreased baking sheet when cool. So the next batch, I didn't wait to take them off, and they came off the pan more easily. And here's what they looked like when they were cooled. Once again, I have a glass of milk to cleanse my palate. These have a good bit of hype to live up to, so I'm excited to give them a taste. The smell is very interesting. That combination of the molasses and the lemon zest, it's just something that I don't encounter very often. Also of note, they're very lightweight, and they seem like they're going to be nice and crispy, but let's give them a go. Wow. They're fairly sweet. Crispy on the edges. You definitely get that molasses flavor, but then you also get the lemon zest. And I would say that the lemon zest gives them a nice fresh flavor. That's pretty good, but wow, my brain is just doing a lot of things. It's like, is this a molasses cookie? Is this an oatmeal cookie? Is this a lemon cookie? Wow, I can't wrap my brain around it. I don't know what to think about it. They're crispy on the edges, but a little bit soft in the middle. Those are pretty good. They're pretty flavorful. Would I say that they are the best oatmeal cookie ever? That's a pretty big claim. I gotta give it another go. I just not sure what to think about it. I really like that. It's pretty dang good. I really like the texture while they're fresh like this. I'm wondering how they'll hold up as they sit for a day or two though. I think that the previous owner had the correct rating of good for these. Well, I hope you had as much fun watching me taste these cookies as I did making them. These recipes kind of feel like home for me because I grew up baking from Betty Crocker. The simplicity of the recipes may seem inadequate or lacking for some, but that's what makes them easy and doable for me. And when a cookbook is as well loved as this one, it really feels like you're holding a bit of history in your hands. Until next time. Gold medal flour bait.